Jake Morrison saw the enemy ships appear on his scanner like deadly stars against the black of space, and he knew his small scout vessel had no chance against him, but he kept flying anyway because that was what humans did when the odds were impossible. The three Caltharian warships moved with the grace of predators closing in on wounded prey, and their dark metal hulls gleamed with an alien beauty that spoke of technology far beyond anything Earth had ever produced. His communication system crackled to life with harsh alien voices speaking in their crystal-sharp language, and though he could not understand the words, he knew they were demanding his surrender. But Jake had orders to gather intelligence on enemy movements near the Vega system, and he was not about to give up without completing his mission, even if it meant certain death. First energy blast tore through his ship's left wing and sent him spinning toward the nearest planet, while alarms screamed warnings about hull breaches and system failures. But Jake fought to maintain control because every second he stayed alive was another second he could transmit data back to Earth about Caltharian fleet positions and battle tactics. Another blast struck his engine core, and suddenly his ship was nothing more than a falling metal coffin racing toward the surface of an unknown world. But Jake managed to activate his emergency beacon before the crash, and he hoped desperately that someone back home would receive the signal and know what had happened to the crew of the TDF Valiant. The impact threw him against his restraints with bone-crushing force, and the world went dark for a time that might have been minutes or hours. But when consciousness returned, he found himself surrounded by towering alien figures whose crystalline skin reflected the light from their weapons in patterns that hurt to look at directly. These were Caltharians, and Jake had seen pictures of them in military briefings, but seeing them in person was entirely different because they stood nearly 8 feet tall with 4 arms that moved independently, and their faces were angular planes of living crystal that showed no emotion he could recognize as they bound his hands with restraints that felt warm against his skin. They spoke to each other in their musical language while examining him like scientists studying a new specimen. And Kifrin Tossman, Jake tried to remember everything he had learned about their culture during his training, but most of what Earth knew about the Caltharian Empire came from stories told by refugees who had escaped their conquered worlds. Journey to their ship took place in silence, except for the sound of their feet on metal floors, and Jake noticed how their technology seemed to blend organic curves with geometric precision in ways that suggested a completely different approach to engineering than anything humans had. Developed inside their vessel, the corridors stretched endlessly in directions that seemed to fold back on themselves, and the walls pulsed with a faint inner light that made Jake feel dizzy if he stared too long, but he forced himself to memorize every detail because intelligence gathering was still his primary mission. Even as a prisoner, his cell was a perfect cube of some transparent material that allowed him to see out but prevented any sound from escaping. And the prisoner he's saping, and the poor Caltharians left him there without food or water while they prepared whatever came next in their process of dealing with captured enemies. Hours passed before a new group of aliens arrived, and these wore different markings on their crystal skin that Jake guessed indicated higher rank based on the way the guards stepped aside and lowered their weapons. In what might have been respect or fear, the largest of the newcomers studied Jake through the transparent walls of his cell, and when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones, even though he could not understand the words being said. They brought machines' necks, and these hummed with energy that made Jake's teeth ache, while sensors swept over his body, recording details about human physiology that would probably be used to design better weapons for killing his species. But he remained still and silent because showing fear would accomplish nothing. The interrogation began on what Jake estimated was his 3rd day of captivity, and it started simply with questions asked in broken English by a Caltharian who had apparently studied human languages, though its pronunciation turned familiar words into alien sounds that barely resembled speech. They wanted to know about Earth's defenses and the location of human colonies and the size of the fleet, but Jake gave them only his name and rank and serial number, just as military protocol demanded. even though he suspected these aliens had ways of extracting information that went far beyond anything covered in his resistance training when simple questions failed. They brought devices that projected images directly into his mind, and for terrible moments, Jake found himself reliving memories of his childhood on Mars colony, while alien thoughts tried to push their way into his consciousness like invasive fingers searching through files in his brain. But something in human neural structure seemed to resist their technology because the images remained fuzzy and incomplete, and Jake discovered he could focus on specific memories to block their access to information they actually wanted while feeding them useless details about his favorite foods and old girlfriends. The sessions grew longer and more intense as days turned into weeks, and Jake learned that the Caltharian Empire had been expanding across the galaxy for thousands of years, consuming worlds and enslaving species with the casual efficiency of a machine built for destruction. His captors seemed genuinely puzzled by his resistance, because in their experience, most prisoners broke quickly under their advanced interrogation methods, and they began studying him as much for scientific curiosity as for military intelligence. Between sessions, Jake observed everything he could about the ship's routine and the behavior of his guards, and he began to understand that the Caltharian Empire was built on absolute hierarchy, where every being knew exactly their place in the chain of command and never questioned orders from above. This rigid structure was their strength because it allowed them to coordinate massive military campaigns across vast distances. But Jake began to suspect it might also be their greatest weakness, because systems that could not adapt were vulnerable to the kind of chaos that humans specialized in creating. The maximum security prison on Zephyria Prime was a monument to Caltharian engineering, and it hung in space like a black metal flower with petals that were actually detention blocks designed to hold the most dangerous enemies of the Empire. But Jake Morrison found himself thinking it looked more like a cage built by beings who had forgotten what freedom meant. His new cell was larger than the one on the ship, but the walls were still transparent, and he could see other prisoners in identical cubes stretching away in all directions like a three-dimensional chessboard, where every piece was a captured soul waiting for their final move in a game they could never win. The first person to speak to him was a woman with pale blue skin and silver hair who occupied the cell directly across from his, and when she noticed him looking in her direction, she pressed her hand against the transparent wall and mouthed words in a language he did not recognize. Jake responded by holding up his own hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of greeting, and the woman smiled in a way that seemed familiar despite her alien features, and he realized that some expressions transcended species boundaries, because hope and despair looked the same no matter what world you came from. Over the following days, Jake learned that the woman was Dr. Zara Oleg from the Antarian star system, and she had been imprisoned for 50 years after her people tried to resist Caltharian occupation of their homeworld, but failed because they had no experience with the kind of total warfare that the Empire brought to every conflict in. The cell next to Zara was Captain Rex Thorne, whose weathered face and gray beard made him look like an old pirate from ancient Earth stories, and Rex had been leading a guerrilla war against Caltharian mining operations in the Centauri sector until his luck ran out during a raid that went wrong. The three of them developed a simple communication system using hand signals and written messages that they held up to their cell walls, and through this method, Jake learned that the prison held representatives from dozens of species that had fallen to Caltharian expansion over the centuries. Most of the prisoners had given up hope long ago and spent their days in silent despair, but Jake noticed that his arrival seemed to stir something in the others, because humans were still fighting the Empire, and that meant resistance was still possible, even if victory seemed impossible. Jake began sharing stories about human military history and the tactics that small forces had used throughout the centuries to defeat larger and better equipped enemies, and though he had to pantomime most of his explanations, the other prisoners seemed to understand the basic concepts he was trying to convey. He told them about guerrilla warfare and how the American colonists had defeated the British Empire by refusing to fight conventional battles, and about how the Vietnamese had worn down a superior military force through patience and determination, and about how successful resistance movements always started with people who refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. Rex was the first to grasp what Jake was suggesting, and he began adding his own examples of successful raids against Caltharian supply lines and how small acts of sabotage could disrupt enemy operations far beyond their apparent significance. Zara contributed her scientific knowledge about Caltharian technology and explained how their systems were designed for efficiency rather than flexibility, which meant they often had hidden vulnerabilities that could be exploited by people who thought differently about problem solving. Their conversations had to be conducted in secret because the guards monitored everything, but Jake realized that the Caltharians were so confident in their prison security that they paid little attention to prisoner behavior as long as no one tried to escape or cause obvious trouble. This oversight gave the three conspirators room to begin planning small acts of resistance that would test their theories about Caltharian weaknesses while building a network of cooperation among the other prisoners. They started with simple things like synchronized meal refusals that forced guards to spend extra time dealing with uncooperative prisoners and coordinated exercises that created noise and distraction during shift changes when security was normally at its most routine. Each small success proved that organized resistance was possible even under the most controlled conditions, and gradually other prisoners began participating in their activities because they remembered what it felt like to fight back against oppression. Jake observed that the Caltharian guards operated according to strict protocols that never varied regardless of circumstances, and this predictability meant their responses could be anticipated and planned for in ways that gave prisoners small advantages that could be accumulated over time. The prison's daily routine became a laboratory for testing human theories about asymmetric warfare, and Jake discovered that concepts which had worked on Earth were equally effective against alien opponents because the fundamental principles of resistance were universal. Zara used her scientific training to analyze the prison systems, and she identified several points where minor disruptions could cascade into major problems, but only if the timing was coordinated perfectly among multiple prisoners acting simultaneously. Rex contributed his practical experience with sabotage and taught the others how to cause equipment failures that would look accidental to investigators, but actually resulted from subtle interference with normal operations. Their activities remained invisible to the prison administration for weeks because the effects were distributed across different systems and different shifts, so no single guard or supervisor noticed a pattern of increasing inefficiency. Jake realized they were proving something important about the nature of empire because the Caltharians controlled their subjects through overwhelming force and rigid hierarchy, but they had no defense against the kind of creative chaos that humans could generate when they worked together. The prison was a perfect microcosm of the larger empire, and if their small group could disrupt its operations, then similar tactics might work on a galactic scale, but only if they could find a way to communicate their discoveries to resistance movements on other worlds. Led Jake to focus his attention on the prison's communication systems, and he began studying the guards' equipment during their daily inspections, looking for weaknesses that might allow unauthorized transmission. Zara had noticed that maintenance workers occasionally brought portable devices into the detention areas for routine repairs, and she suggested that these tools might be modified to send messages if they could find a way to access them without being detected. Rex proposed that they needed to recruit sympathetic guards or staff members who might be willing to help their cause, but Jake was skeptical because the Caltharian military structure seemed designed to prevent exactly that kind of internal dissent. However, their conversations had been overheard by other prisoners who began contributing their own observations about guard behavior, and prisoner Jake learned that not all Caltharians were equally committed to the Empire's goals. Some of the younger guards seemed uncomfortable with their duties and occasionally showed small acts of mercy that suggested they might be open to different ideas about how prisoners should be treated. This discovery gave Jake hope that their resistance network might eventually extend beyond the prison walls. Because if they could change the minds of their captors, then the Empire's foundation of absolute obedience might not be as solid as it appeared. The young Caltharian guard named Kefmer moved differently than the others, and Jake noticed this during the daily inspection routine. When most guards simply checked cell seals and moved on, but Kefmer sometimes paused to look at prisoners, as if he was seeing them as individuals, rather than just security threats to be contained. His crystalline skin showed more green than purple, which Jake had learned indicated lower caste status, and his movements carried a hesitation that suggested he was still learning his duties, rather than performing them with the mechanical precision of more experienced guards. Jake began making subtle gestures when Kefmer passed his cell, and after several days the guards started responding with small nods that might have been acknowledgement or might have been coincidence, but Jake chose to interpret them as signs of possible communication. Breakthrough came when Jake pretended to be sick during a routine check, and Kefmer lingered longer than necessary to observe his condition. And in that moment, Jake caught the guard's eye and spoke a single word in English that he had heard. Caltharian interrogators use. The word meant why, and Jake pointed first to himself, then to the walls of his cell, and finally to Kefmer, while repeating the question because he wanted to know why a being who seemed capable of independent thought would choose to serve a system that crushed freedom wherever it found it. Kefmer looked around to make sure no other guards were watching, then moved closer to Jake's cell and whispered something in his own language that sounded like it might have been a question, but Jake could only shake his head to indicate he did not understand. This began a slow process of communication that developed over many weeks as Jake and Kefmer found ways to exchange basic concepts, using gestures and simple drawings that could be quickly erased if other guards approached unexpectedly. Jake learned that Kefmer came from a mining world where his family had worked in dangerous conditions extracting rare crystals that were used to power Caltharian starships and weapons, but the profits from their labor went to higher caste families who lived in luxury. On the capital worlds, when Kefmer's older brother died in a mine collapse caused by unsafe working conditions, the family received no compensation because lower caste lives were considered expendable in the Empire's economic calculations. Military service offered Kefmer's only chance to improve his status, but even as a guard he remained at the bottom of the hierarchy and was expected to follow orders without question, regardless of his personal feelings about those orders. Jake began sharing stories about human history and the concept that all people deserve basic rights regardless of their birth circumstances, and though Kefmer struggled to understand these ideas at first, they clearly resonated with his own experiences of injustice. The human concept of equality was revolutionary to a being raised in a rigid caste system, and Jake could see Kefmer wrestling with ideas that challenged everything he had been taught about the natural order of society. Their conversations had to remain hidden from other guards and prison officials, but Jake realized that Kefmer was not the only Caltharian who might be open to different ways of thinking about power and authority. Through Kefmer, Jake learned that discontent was growing throughout the Empire as endless wars of expansion consumed resources and lives while producing few benefits for ordinary citizens who bore the cost of maintaining galactic dominance. Recent rebellions on outer worlds had required increasingly brutal suppression methods that troubled some Caltharian military officers who had originally joined the service to protect their people rather than to slaughter civilians on distant planets. The Empire's leadership responded to these challenges by demanding even greater loyalty and more aggressive expansion, but this only increased the burden on lower castes who provided the soldiers and workers necessary for imperial operations. Jake realized that the Caltharian Empire was facing the same internal contradictions that had destroyed powerful civilizations throughout human history, and all it needed was the right kind of pressure applied at the right moment to trigger a collapse. Meanwhile, the prisoner resistance network continued to grow as Jake, Rex, and Zara recruited more participants in their campaign of subtle sabotage and psychological warfare against their captors' work crews. began experiencing mysterious equipment failures that forced supervisors to assign extra personnel to routine maintenance tasks, while food distribution became irregular due to unexplained delays in the kitchen operations guard. Rotations were disrupted by coordinated prisoner requests for medical attention or religious observances that forced administrators to spend time dealing with bureaucratic complications rather than focusing on security matters. Each individual incident seemed minor, but their cumulative effect was to reduce the prison's efficiency and increase stress levels among staff members who could not understand why their normally smooth operations were becoming increasingly chaotic. Jake taught the other prisoners about the psychological aspects of resistance and how sustained pressure could gradually break down the confidence and morale of their oppressors, even when no single act of defiance was particularly dramatic. Dr. Zara made a crucial discovery while working in the prison's technical maintenance section, where she had been assigned to repair communication equipment, and she found that the Caltharian quantum entanglement network relied on a central processing node that coordinated messages across the entire empire. If that node could be disrupted, it would create a communication blackout that might last for hours, and during that time, isolated military commanders would be unable to coordinate responses to simultaneous uprisings on multiple worlds. The processing node was located in the Imperial Palace on the capital world, and accessing it would require infiltrating the most heavily defended location in Caltharian space. But Jake began developing ideas about how this seemingly impossible task might be accomplished. Ed Kamar provided crucial intelligence about palace security procedures when he mentioned that he had been selected for advanced training that might lead to assignment in the Emperor's personal guard unit. This opportunity represented their best chance to get someone inside the palace who could plant the disruption device that Zara was designing using components salvaged from prison maintenance equipment. The plan will require perfect timing and enormous personal risk, because discovery would mean immediate execution for all participants. But Jake convinced the others that they had no choice except to try, because the alternative was to remain prisoners forever, while the Empire continued its expansion across the galaxy. Mar agreed to help despite the danger, because he had come to understand that the Empire's survival meant continued oppression for billions of beings, including his own people, and he was no longer willing to serve a system that treated lives as expendable resources. Jake felt the weight of responsibility for involving others in such a dangerous scheme, but he also recognized that this might be their only opportunity to strike a meaningful blow against the Empire's power structure. Success of their plan would depend on coordination between prison resistors, palace infiltrators, and rebel groups on dozens of worlds. But Jake had faith in the power of human strategic thinking combined with the universal desire for freedom that existed in every intelligent species. The message came through Kefmer 3 days before Jake's scheduled execution, and it contained news that changed everything about their carefully planned infiltration, because Emperor Vextol himself had decided to conduct one final interrogation of the human prisoner who had proven so surprisingly resistant to standard techniques. Jake realized this unexpected development could either destroy their mission completely or provide an opportunity that was even better than their original plan, because getting close to the Emperor would give him access to the most sensitive areas of the Imperial Palace. Kethmar explained that the execution ceremony was being moved to the palace throne room so that the Emperor could personally demonstrate what happened to beings who defy Caltharian authority, and this change in venue would allow their infiltration team to reach the communication center without having to penetrate multiple security layers. The quantum disruptor device that Dr. Zara had constructed from salvaged components was small enough to be concealed on Jake's body, but getting it past the security scanners would require modifications to his prison restraints that could only be made during the transfer process. Rex had identified 3 other prisoners who were willing to create diversions during the transport operation, and though they knew they would probably die in the attempt, they insisted on participating because this represented their first real chance to strike back at their oppressors. Jake spent his final night in the prison cell reviewing every detail of the plan and trying to prepare himself mentally for what would probably be his last mission, but he found himself thinking about Earth and wondering if anyone back home would ever know what had happened to the crew of the TDF Valiant. The transfer began at dawn when a full squad of Caltharian guards arrived to escort Jake to the transport ship that would carry him to his execution. And as they removed him from his cell, he exchanged final glances with Zara and Rex, who would remain behind to coordinate prisoner uprisings. If the mission succeeded, Hammer was part of the escort detail, and during the walk through the prison corridors, he managed to slip Jake a small cutting tool that had been disguised as a routine restraint adjustment device, and this would allow him to free himself from his bonds at the crucial moment. Journey to the Imperial Palace took several hours aboard a heavily armed transport vessel, and Jake used this time to study the behavior patterns of his guards while making final preparations for the device. Concealment. When they reached the palace, Jake was overwhelmed by its massive scale and alien architecture, because the building seemed to grow directly from the planet's surface, like a crystalline mountain that had been shaped by intelligence rather than geological forces. The throne room was a vast space with walls that curved upward toward a ceiling lost in shadows, and at its center sat Emperor Vexto on a throne carved from a single enormous crystal that pulsed with internal light. Jake had seen images of the Emperor during his military briefings, but meeting him in person was a completely different experience, because the alien ruler radiated an aura of absolute power that had been accumulated over centuries of unchallenged dominance. Emperor spoke to Jake in perfect English, and his voice carried harmonics that seemed designed to inspire fear and submission. But Jake forced himself to maintain eye contact, because showing weakness now would undermine everything they were trying to accomplish. Emperor Vexto wanted to understand what made humans different from other species the Empire had conquered, and he asked Jake to explain why his people continued fighting when defeat was inevitable, given the vast disparity in technology and resources. Jake's response surprised everyone in the throne room, because instead of defiance or desperation, he showed genuine pity for the Emperor and explained that history would remember him not as a great conqueror, but as the last ruler of a dying empire that fell, because it never understood what made civilizations truly strong. The Emperor became enraged by what he perceived as condescension from a primitive being and ordered Jake's immediate execution. But this acceleration of the timeline forced their plan into motion before all preparations were complete. Ekithar created the planned distraction by staging an equipment malfunction that triggered security alerts throughout the palace, while Jake used a concealed cutting tool to break free from his restraints. Just as the execution was supposed to begin, the chaos that followed allowed Jake to reach the communication center, but not without alerting palace guards, who began converging on his location from all directions, and he realized he would not have enough time to plant the device and escape with. Enemy forces closing in. Jake sent Kethmer away to safety while he fought his way deeper into the communication facility, toward the central processing node that controlled quantum entanglement communications across the entire empire. The node itself was a massive crystalline structure that hummed with energy patterns that hurt to observe directly, and Jake could feel its power pressing against his mind. Like a living thing that resented his presence in its sacred space, palace guards burst into the chamber just as Jake activated Dr. Zara's quantum disruptor and attached it to the base of the processing node, where it would cause maximum damage to the delicate quantum field alignments that made faster-than-light communication possible. The explosion that followed was not just physical, but seemed to tear at the fabric of space itself, as quantum entanglements that had existed for thousands of years were suddenly severed, and the communication network that held the Empire together. When Silent Jake survived the blast, but found himself trapped in a collapsing facility with Emperor Vexto himself, who had come personally to ensure that the communication system would be restored before rebel groups could take advantage of the blackout. The confrontation between human prisoner and alien emperor became symbolic of the larger struggle between freedom and oppression, as Jake explained that every minute the communications remained down was another minute for enslaved worlds to remember what independence felt like. Emperor Vexto tried to kill Jake, with his bare hands, but discovered that humans were surprisingly difficult to defeat in close combat because they fought with a desperation and creativity that Caltharian military training had never prepared him to counter. Jake did not need to win the fight because his mission was simply to buy time for the rebellion to spread, and every second he kept the Emperor occupied was another second for isolated garrison commanders to realize they could no longer count on reinforcements from the capital worlds. Palace shook with secondary explosions as the quantum disruption cascaded through connected systems, and Jake knew that even if he died here, the Empire would never recover from the damage they had inflicted on its communication infrastructure. The silence that fell across the galaxy was more terrifying to the Caltharian Empire than any enemy fleet could have been, because for 3,000 years, their power had depended on the ability to coordinate military responses across vast distances. And now that coordination was gone on 1,000 worlds, garrison commanders found themselves cut off from central command, with no way to request reinforcements or receive new orders, and for the first time in their careers, they had to make decisions. Without knowing what the Emperor wanted them to do, Dr. Zara and the other prisoners had been freed during the chaos of Jake's assault on the communications center, and they worked with Kefma to establish emergency broadcast stations using captured equipment to spread word that the revolution had finally begun. The message they transmitted was simple but devastating in its implications, because it told every enslaved species in the galaxy that the Empire's communication network was broken. And for the first time in centuries, successful rebellion was actually possible. Within hours of the blackout, uprisings began on dozens of worlds as resistance groups that had been planning for years suddenly found themselves facing isolated enemy forces that could neither call for help nor coordinate effective counterattacks. Psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming because the Caltharian Empire's greatest weapon had always been the belief that resistance was futile, but once that illusion was shattered, their vast military advantages became almost irrelevant on the mining worlds where Kefma's people had suffered for generations. The lower castes rose up against their supervisors and seized control of the crystal extraction facilities that powered the Empire's war machine. Agricultural planets stopped shipping food to military installations, while industrial worlds shut down the factories that produced weapons and equipment for Caltharian forces throughout the galaxy. Even on the capital worlds themselves, cracks began appearing in the rigid caste system as younger Caltharians like Kefma questioned why they should continue serving leaders who had led their civilization into an unwinnable war against the concept of freedom itself. Jake fought his way through the collapsing palace, while Emperor Vextol pursued him with the desperate fury of a being whose entire worldview was crumbling along with his empire, but the human had no intention of engaging in personal combat when his real enemy was a system of oppression the Emperor represented. Palace corridors were filled with smoke and debris from the quantum explosion and emergency lighting cast strange shadows that made the alien architecture look even more forbidding. But Jake pressed forward because he knew that every minute he remained free was another minute for the rebellion to spread. He reached a communication station that was still partially functional and managed to contact the emergency broadcast network that Zara and Kefma had established to coordinate rebel activities across the galaxy. Through this connection, Jake learned that the uprisings were succeeding beyond their wildest hopes because isolated Caltharian garrisons were surrendering rather than fighting hopeless battles against entire populations that had suddenly remembered how to resist. Empire's military doctrine had never prepared commanders for simultaneous rebellions on hundreds of worlds because their strategy had always been to crush resistance movements one at a time, using overwhelming force concentrated from multiple systems. Without central coordination, that strategy became impossible, and individual garrison commanders found themselves making desperate choices between retreating to more defensible positions or trying to maintain control over populations that no longer feared Caltharian retaliation. Jake realized that they had not just damaged the Empire's communication system, but had struck at the heart of authoritarian power, which always depended on the ability to make subjects believe That resistance would be met with swift and terrible punishment. Emperor Vextol finally cornered Jake in a damaged section of the palace, where fallen debris blocked most of the exits and the alien ruler's crystal skin was cracked and bleeding from the explosion, but his eyes still burned with the fury of absolute power. Challenged for the first time, the Emperor demanded to know how one primitive human had managed to destroy an empire that had dominated the galaxy for millennia. But Jake explained that he had not destroyed anything because the empire had been destroying itself through its own contradictions. Every act of oppression had created new enemies, while every expansion had stretched resources thinner, and every demand for absolute loyalty had bred resentment among those forced to sacrifice their lives and freedom for the glory of rulers who gave nothing in return. The Caltharian Empire had contained the seeds of its own destruction from the moment it chose to rule through fear rather than earning the genuine cooperation of its subjects, and Jake had simply provided the spark that ignited rebellion in hearts that had never stopped yearning for freedom. As they spoke, the palace shook with new explosions as rebel forces that had been inspired by news of the communication center's destruction fought their way through the capital cities. Defenses toward the seat of imperial power. Emperor Vextol realized that his throne room was no longer a symbol of invincible authority, but had become a trap where he would make his final stand against forces he could no longer control or even fully understand. The sound of approaching battle grew louder as Caltharian rebels led by former guards like Kefmer joined forces with freed prisoners and sympathetic civilians to storm the palace where their emperor had ruled with unquestioned authority for so many years. Jake knew that his personal survival was less important than ensuring the rebellion's success, and he used his remaining strength to transmit final intelligence about palace defenses to the approaching rebel forces. Quantum disruption had created cascading failures throughout the Empire's infrastructure, and Jake could see through the palace windows that the capital city itself was beginning to tear itself apart as different factions fought for control of the remnants of imperial power. But he also saw something more hopeful in the distance, where ships from a dozen different species were arriving to offer aid to the rebellion, and Jake realized that the galaxy was finally ready to build something better than empire on the ruins of Caltharian tyranny. The last message Jake transmitted before the communication station failed completely was a simple declaration that would be remembered long after the empire fell, because it captured the essential truth that had made their victory possible against impossible odds. He told the galaxy that freedom was not something that could be granted by rulers or taken away by conquerors, because it lived in the hearts of every thinking being and would always find a way to break the chains that others tried to impose. 6 months after the fall of the Caltharian Empire, the galaxy had become a very different place, and Jake Morrison found himself standing in what had once been Emperor Vextor's throne room, watching representatives from dozens of species work together to establish the foundation of a new kind of interstellar civilization. Massive crystal throne had been removed and replaced with a simple circular table where former slaves and former masters sat as equals to discuss trade agreements and mutual defense pacts based on voluntary cooperation rather than imposed authority. Jake's injuries from the palace battle had healed slowly but completely, and he had spent his recovery time traveling between worlds to help establish the Morrison doctrine, which had become the philosophical foundation for the new confederation of free systems. The doctrine was surprisingly simple in its basic principles because it stated that all sentient beings had the right to determine their own government, and that no species or world had the authority to impose its will on others, regardless of technological or military advantages. Implementation of these principles proved more challenging than their statement because 3,000 years of imperial rule had created complex dependencies and deep resentments that could not be resolved through good intentions alone. Some worlds struggled with the transition to self-governance after centuries of having every decision made by distant authorities, while others faced economic collapse when imperial trade networks were disrupted by the rebellion. Former Caltharian military officers like Kefmer worked tirelessly to help their own people adapt to a society where orders came from elected representatives, rather than hereditary nobles, and where lower castes could rise to positions of authority, based on merit rather than birth. Dr. Zara had become the Confederation's leading expert on communication technology, and she was developing new quantum networks, designed to connect worlds without creating the kind of centralized control points that had made the Empire vulnerable to the disruption. Attack Rex Thorne led efforts to hunt down die-hard imperialists who refused to accept the new order and continued launching terrorist attacks against civilian targets in hopes of destabilizing the emerging democratic governments. The work was difficult and sometimes frustrating because building free societies required patience and compromise while tearing down empires could be accomplished through dramatic gestures like exploding communication centers. Jake discovered that many rebel leaders wanted him to become the Confederation's first president or supreme commander, but he declined these offers because his role had never been to rule others, but to help them learn how to rule themselves. Instead, he focused on education and wrote extensively about human military history and political philosophy while traveling to universities and training academies throughout the former empire to share lessons about successful resistance movements. His lectures were popular because beings from many species were curious about the human concepts of democracy and individual rights that had proven so effective against Caltharian authoritarianism. Jake explained that these ideas were not uniquely human inventions, but represented universal principles that emerged whenever intelligent beings had the freedom to think about how society should be organized. The most difficult challenge facing the new Confederation was dealing with Emperor Vexthul himself, who had survived the palace battle, but lost everything that had given his life meaning for over 2 centuries rather than executing him as many demanded. The Confederation leaders decided to exile him to a remote agricultural world where he could live out his remaining years in simple obscurity. Jake visited the former emperor once during his exile and found him working in the fields alongside farmers from a dozen different species who had chosen to start new lives far from the political complexities of the core worlds. Vexthul had aged dramatically since losing his throne, and his crystal skin had become dull and gray, but his eyes still held traces of the intelligence that had once ruled the Galactic Empire there. Conversation was brief because neither being had much to say to the other, but Jake left behind books about human history and philosophy as he had promised. During their final confrontation in the collapsing palace, the transformation of Caltharian society proved that even the most rigid hierarchies could adapt to new circumstances when their members were given genuine choices about how to live their lives. Many former nobles struggled with the loss of their privileged status, but others discovered talents and interests they had never been allowed to explore under the old system, where everyone's role was determined by caste rather than inclination. Economic transition was managed through careful planning that avoided the complete collapse Jake had initially feared might follow the Empire's destruction. New trade relationships developed between worlds that had previously been connected only through imperial taxation and resource extraction, and these partnerships proved more stable than the old system because they were based on mutual benefit rather than enforced compliance. Jake's final report to Earth was much longer than his initial mission briefing had anticipated because he had to explain not just military intelligence about Caltharian capabilities, but the entire process of galactic transformation that had followed their victory. Described how the rebellion had succeeded, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through the power of ideas that resonated with the universal desire for freedom and dignity. The report concluded with Jake's assessment that humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization would not be military conquest or technological advancement, but the demonstration that free societies were stronger and more creative than authoritarian empires. Earth's government responded by establishing diplomatic relations with the new Confederation and offering to share human knowledge about democratic institutions while learning from alien perspectives on governance and social organization. The galaxy 6 months after the Empire's fall was still chaotic and uncertain. But it was also alive with possibilities that had been impossible under Imperial rule as exploration ships from dozens of species, pushed into previously forbidden regions of space trade routes, reopened between worlds that had been separated by artificial barriers, while scientific research flourished as species shared knowledge that had been classified as state secrets under the old regime. Jake Morrison returned to Earth as a hero, but he found that fame sat uncomfortably on his shoulders, because he knew that the real heroes were beings like Kethmer and Zara, who had risked everything to build something better from the ruins of tyranny. His final public statement was simple and direct, because he wanted people to understand that the victory belonged not to any individual, but to everyone who had refused to accept that oppression was the natural order of the universe. Statement read that one human prisoner had not broken an empire, because empires always contained the seeds of their own destruction, and all he had done was help others recognize that the time had come to plant those seeds and watch freedom grow.